Okay, so let's kick it off. Again, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk to you all. And before I get into the substance of my remarks, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which I am speaking today. And so let me share with you all the here we go. So the MIT Indigenous Peoples Advocacy Committee, in part with MIT's American Indian Science and Engineering Society, the Native American Student Association, and other Indigenous MIT students and alumni have developed the following land acknowledgement statement. And they've invited members of the MIT community to use this statement whenever there are opening events that take place at MIT. MIT acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which I sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. So thank you for letting me do that. And thanks for also asking me to talk about CREOS. So as Christy noted, CREOS is the Center for Research on Equitable and Open Scholarship situated within the MIT libraries. I'm excited to talk to you about it. It's a great project. It's more than a project now, it's an actual research center. And the website, I included the website link in there, so feel free to sort of poke around the website while I talk. And we don't have a logo yet, so enjoy this picture of fall in New England. So a little bit more context before I really jump into the substance here. This is a meta comment, if you will. I am really excited to give this talk, but I have to admit that like many folks, I have suffered from Zoom fatigue after many, many months of existing mostly on Zoom. And I am very much still getting used to giving talks and presentations via Zoom. Don't get me wrong, I know that there are all kinds of advantages for participation and inclusion for doing things online. And I'm excited about that. I'm excited that you know, we can have this interaction in a way that maybe we wouldn't be able to do in person. But giving a presentation this way can sometimes feel like I'm talking to empty chairs or talking into the void. So bear with me. Another challenge that I might end up having is I'm giving this talk from our new campus offices in a renovated library that is LEED Gold certified for sustainability. But what that means is that if I don't move around enough, the lights might go off. And if they do, and you see me I'll just wave my hands around and they'll go back on, but bear with me. So I'm going to talk about CREOS, and before I do that, though, I do want to sort of back up a little bit and sort of establish the case for open and equitable scholarship before we start talking about a Center for Research on Open and Equitable Scholarship. And I recognize that when I do this, I'm often sort of preaching to the choir, if you will. I sometimes hope that rather than just preaching to the choir, the things I say might sort of equip the choir, fortify the choir. So another quick note is that I am going to use the terms open science and open scholarship somewhat interchangeably. And I know there's some controversy around that. I prefer to use the more inclusive term scholarship, but some of my source materials use the term open science. And so that's, I defer to the source in that case. So just to sort of start to unpack the idea of what is open science, what is open scholarship, whenever I'm asked to do that, I like to start by referring to something that a colleague of mine here at MIT, a sociologist, Susan Silby, wrote in 2013. And she wasn't writing about open scholarship. She was writing about the sociology of law. but she ended up writing about science as a democratic practice. And I don't usually read slides, but I'm going to read this one because I find it very powerful. What Susan writes is that the value of science derives primarily from the transparency and public representation of its methods by displaying the grounds of our claims and the sources of our evidence. This makes knowledge production a collaborative activity, a public civic engagement with others, other scholars and audiences. So essentially what Susan is saying, and again, I use it all the time because I find so much merit to it, is that what makes science science and not just sort of private tinkering in your garage is the sharing and the transparency and the opening up of one's work, one's methods, one's theory, one's data, one's results, the interpretations to others so that they can critically engage with it. Importantly, to say that knowledge production is collaborative is not meant to imply consensus. In fact, Susan goes on to say, fierce debates rage between proponents of different approaches, different paradigms of investigation, and competing theories of explanation for similar phenomena. What is required to satisfy the model I am describing, and this is Susan talking, what is required to satisfy the model I am describing is not quietude by any means, or moment-by-moment agreement. Differences in contestation can be accommodated with this model of democratic participatory knowledge making, so long as there is an effort to make transparent the ways in which knowledge claims have been produced. Essentially, knowledge claims cannot be private, so that one person knows but cannot demonstrate empirically to others what is known or how it came to be known. In other words, in this perspective, open science is just science. Now, there are more conventional definitions and simpler ones of what open science is. This one is from the recently released report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Basically, under this definition, open science is an umbrella term for efforts to share research outputs broadly, whether those efforts are individual, organizational, or community efforts. But why should we care about open scholarship? What's our interest here in open scholarship? If we take the Sylvie argument seriously, then we could conclude that the case for open scholarship has already been made. But I think we all know that even though an open scholarship agenda is gaining perhaps wider acceptance across the academy, across disciplines, there we go. Okay, it's still useful to delineate the advantages that are presumed to flow from open sharing of scholarship. So I'll do that. One advantage that's usually cited is that openness in scholarship accelerates discovery. The best and most recent example, I think, of that is that thanks to the rapid opening up of research and data, the genetic sequencing of the COVID-19 virus was completed within 1 month of the first reported case. Open sharing of research and data about COVID-19 also led to a much more rapid than usual cycle of iterative and corrective accumulation and evaluation of knowledge claims about the virus and about the efficacy of various interventions. So real world timely example of openness accelerating problem solving. Open scholarship, open data especially, facilitates new forms of research using artificial intelligence and machine learning. Open science, open scholarship can contribute to knowledge equity as more people are provided access to knowledge claims and to outputs of research. That, of course, can enable citizen science. Open science and openness of one's research outputs and, in fact, on one's methods can facilitate, and data, of course, can facilitate replication and the integrity of science, which then also could enhance public trust in science. But here's the thing. there's all these great examples of openness in research conveying advantages, and many of us, when we talk about open scholarship and try and sell open scholarship to our communities or our peers, we claim these advantages. But there's actually precious little rigorous research to support these claims. And that, in a nutshell, is a big part of why we launched CREOS. The lack of research on open and equitable scholarship is actually part of a larger gap in research on scholarship more generally. And this topic is covered really well in a September 2018 issue of Science magazine that was devoted to research on research. And in that issue, the editors put it this way. They said, many notions about how people and practices, policies, and resources influence the course of science are still more rooted in traditions and intuitions than in evidence. And certainly I found that to be true in conversations I have across my campus as I talk to people about open scholarship. Many of the responses that I get, or reactions or comments, are based on people's own experiences, their own anecdotes, their own perspective. So otherwise, brilliant scientists who would not be persuaded on any other issue by anecdotes or personal opinion are free to offer that. Feel free to offer those in defense of or in criticism of various ideas about advancing open scholarship. So it's clear to me, and I hope to many of you, that there's definitely a lack of evidence, not just about the advantages and why we might pursue open scholarship and what the outcome of pursuing open and equitable scholarship might be. But we also lack evidence that would guide us in finding the most effective paths to advance open and equitable scholarship. We also know that when it comes to the relationship between openness and equity in scholarship, the available evidence is, again, quite rare. And it's actually what we do have is rather mixed. It's become increasingly clear to many of us that open scholarship is a necessary but not sufficient prerequisite for advancing equity and inclusion in scholarly publishing. And what I'll say is that I think that by definition and by design, the current closed system, the paywall system of scholarly publishing, ensures that scholarship is only accessible to those who can either afford what are often outrageous individual access fees to get to a single journal article, for example, or to those who are affiliated with institutions who can afford often equally outrageous subscription fees. But on the other hand, open scholarship is not automatically more inclusive and equitable. In fact, some would argue, I would, that some of the prevailing models for open access to journal literature are likely to exacerbate global inequalities in scholarly access and participation. And some of the early research that we produced through CREOS indicates that open publishing venues are not necessarily more diverse or more equitable in terms of things like the composition of editorial boards. So openness and equity are not perfectly correlated, and there's some tension. There are times when there is tension that has to be examined so that we can fully understand the relationships there. So in the context of, I hope I've convinced you that there's this, like, what I call a crippling lack of solid data and research to evaluate the efficacy of various models for advancing open scholarship. There's an urgent need to critically evaluate the relationship between openness and equity. So all of that kind of led to folks here at MIT and elsewhere, of course, but this is my story, so I'll tell it. Folks here at MIT to say we should create a center for research that focuses on research on and about open and equitable scholarship. And with that as our context, I want to talk a little bit about how and why we were able to launch this research center and to launch it within the libraries. And for that, there's a little bit of sort of an origin story that I want to tell. So backing up a few years, the idea for this center, for the Center for what would eventually become the Center for Research in Equitable and Open Scholarship, CREOS, has its origins in the report of the MIT Future of Libraries Task Force. Specifically, that report had 10 recommendations, and the final recommendation 10 called for research on research, and specifically for a center for research based in the libraries. The task force at the time made the case that centering this, and this was a task force composed primarily of MIT faculty, some graduate students, some postdocs, some library staff, and some undergraduates, but faculty from all 5 schools at MIT. They made the case that centering a research initiative in the libraries would capitalize on the inherent interdisciplinarity of the libraries. It would allow the research to be informed by the library and information science expertise of the library staff, and it would provide close access to data and collaboration with libraries and with academic publishing. So that was the first sort of hint of we should do this thing. We should have a center for research in the libraries. And of course, I think many origin stories for anything in academia starts with a task force and a recommendation. And then often, at least here at MIT, the next step is, well, let's hold a convening. Let's hold a conference first before we do the thing. So that's what we did. So in response to the recommendation from the Future of Libraries Task Force, the library secured funding from the Mellon Foundation to host a summit on the Grand Challenges in Information Science and Scholarly Communication. And at that summit, we convened approximately 50 scholars and experts from across libraries and publishing, representatives from interested funding agencies, and we brought them together over a period of several days to help us develop a shared research agenda around some of the most pressing challenges in scholarly communications. The final version from that summit is online. It's open access, of course, and the link's there. What I want to share about that summit, though, is honestly, openness, inclusion, diversity, and equity weren't explicit focuses of the summit at the start. The summit was designed to identify grand challenges in information science and scholarly publishing, and we did not identify openness, inclusion, diversity, and equity as key focuses from the start. But we brought these experts together, and those are the issues that dominated the conversation. In fact, the overarching theme, and you'll see it in the final report, that came out of the summit was a general agreement that the future of effective and impactful scholarship will be more open and more participatory. Our summit participants agreed that scholarship is stronger when all who might contribute to and/or make use of scholarly knowledge are able to do so. They also agreed that how to do that, how to effectively and sustainably make research and knowledge openly available and openly accessible to participate in, how to do that is an open question right now. There's a lot of questions, a lot of hard and difficult research problems to solve to make that happen. So from all that context and background, after the summit, after the task force recommendation, we launched CREOS. We launched officially in July of 2019. And what we did is we took this story of this origin story and all of the set of arguments and context about why this was an important thing to do, and we shared it broadly across MIT. We shared it with faculty who we knew to be interested and supportive. We shared it at a full meeting of the faculty. We also shared it with MIT leadership, including all of the school deans and the provost. So here at MIT, any new research center has to be discussed and improved by the dean's group, which is the provost and all the school deans and the other academic leaders who report to the provost. So we did that set of engagements and got the sort of moral and political and substantive and organizational support that said, sure, go launch a center within the libraries focused on research about and to inform open and equitable scholarship. So we said, let there be a center, and we created this center. But I want to be fair and talk about sort of the nitty-gritty operational details of launching this center, because it's one thing to just say we're going to call ourselves a research center, another thing to make it real. This was a priority for me as the director. So even though we didn't have no additional funding initially came to the libraries to launch this research center, but I was happy to commit some of our unrestricted funds towards getting CREOS off the ground. And here I have to give credit where credit's due. I had a head start on this. My predecessor at MIT, the late Ann Wolpert, had already established a researcher position within the libraries in 2012. So the MIT libraries already had Michael Altman, who is a social and information scientist, on our staff conducting and supporting research on information technology, privacy, preservation, and several other topics. And in the beginning, to be honest, the intellectual launch of CREOS was really just about pivoting Micah's research agenda to be more directly focused on issues of open and equitable scholarship. In addition, I tried to devote some intellectual bandwidth, when I wasn't doing my day job of directing the libraries, to helping sort of define the CREOS research agenda and really kind of get us going. I was also able to carve out some funding to hire a deputy director, Sue Kriegsman, who had worked with us as a project manager on the Grand Challenges Summit, so she knew what we were up to. And Sue describes herself as having the niche specialty of launching startups within academic libraries. So she'd worked at Harvard in the Knowledge Lab at Harvard and with the Berkman Klein Center there. So when we launched CREOS and we were able to bring her on board, that was great because we had this skeletal staff, one research scientist, now a deputy director, whatever pieces of my energy and time I could spare. We were definitely in scrappy startup mode at the beginning. And so, one of the first things we did was define our mission. We had a clear vision for what we wanted to do, and we were able to sort of quickly articulate our mission. The short version of our mission in CREOS is to advance knowledge in the service of equitable and open scholarship. What we want to do is support and produce research, rigorous research, methodologically sound research, credible research that would advance our understanding of openness and equity in scholarship and scholarly practices, to inform policies and practices and infrastructure and other work that is intended to advance openness and equity in scholarship. Now, we did realize early on that we would have to be more focused than that. The amount of the need for research to support open and equitable scholarship is broad and wide and deep, and we needed to focus if we were going to be effective. And so we wanted to focus on topics of interest to our MIT community and that were frankly interesting to the core staff of CREOS and to our early supporters. We needed that guiding light. We needed that beacon to keep us focused and on course. So we established the 3 research areas you see here, right? We wanted to really dig in on what are the incentives and barriers to participating in equitable and open scholarship at the individual level, at the institutional level, at the community level. We wanted to do research that would help establish what are the impacts of equitable and open scholarship. And of course, what are the impacts when scholarship isn't open and isn't equitable. And then we also wanted to tackle what is a really tricky and not well established area, which is finding and evaluating sustainable economic models for equitable and open scholarship. So we created this scoping document to help, again, to serve as a sort of beacon, this guiding light, keep us focused, keep us all headed in the same direction. So with that, a mission, a clearly defined research scope, what I call a lean and mean staff, we got to work. Our early activities included a pilot visiting scholar program, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in just a second, a national forum on accessibility and inclusion in library systems. I think there's a link in the references to the white paper that came out of that. That was funded by the IMLS, and we worked with Northeastern on that. And then we're also doing some exploratory research on open monographs, focusing on some of the economic models for open monographs, and also some measures of diversity. Who's producing open monographs? What are the demographics? I want to talk a little bit more about our visiting scholar. So this was a visiting scholar pilot. I want to talk about that because it feels like it was a pretty good model that we want to repeat and scale for additional visiting scholars down the road. So the model here was really a joint funding model. So we had, Philip Cohen, who is a sociologist at the University of Maryland. He's the founding director of Social Archive, an open preprint server for the social sciences, and a big advocate of open scholarship. He was one of the participants in our Grand Challenges Summit, and he continued to want to be involved in our work and to help us sort of launch CREOS. He approached us about the possibility of doing a visiting scholar term with us. We didn't have a whole lot of money for him. He needed salary offset. So we reached out to some of the other institutions who had also participated in the Grand Challenges Summit, and our colleagues at the UCLA libraries, the University of Arizona libraries, the Ohio State University libraries, and University of Pittsburgh libraries all pitched in. And so it's this joint funding model to allow Dr. Cohen to come to MIT and spend a semester focusing purely on research on open and equitable scholarship. His regular research area is in family sociology and demography. So to be able to take a semester and focus purely on research on open and equitable scholarship was a real boon for him. And he wrote a lovely blog post that's on the slide there about how much he enjoyed his time here. And more importantly, his output was terrific, right? It's a great model. So he produced, while he was a visiting scholar, he drafted a scholarly communications primer for sociology aimed primarily at graduate students. And it's a document that reviews sort of major scholarly communication venues in sociology, reviews policies, economic actors, and recent innovations as a way to educate and incentivize sociology scholars, again, mostly grad students, but he found that his fellow faculty were also interested in it. It's a way to educate them and incentivize them to consider open access for their work. He also worked closely with our CREOS research scientist, Micah Altman, on some examining peer review and possible interventions to peer review that would improve equity, transparency, and efficacy in that part of the scholarly communication system. And more importantly, he spent one semester with us, but he has continued to collaborate with us and with others he met during his time at MIT on both research and, frankly, activism and service devoted to open scholarship issues. Our next big move for CREOS was to secure funding again from the Mellon Foundation to support a postdoctoral program. So we won a grant from the Mellon Foundation to fund 3 two-year postdoctoral scholars to do research on equitable and open scholarship. And the idea here is that providing early scholars, right, postdocs, with the resources, the mentoring, the funding, and the time to focus on this kind of research would contribute to establishing research on open and equitable scholarship as an important and viable sort of an emerging research field and field of study. So to make our postdoc program work, we recruited faculty at MIT who would be willing to serve as co-mentors to these postdocs. We ended up with 3 faculty to match our 3 postdocs. We have a faculty member from literature, one from computational linguistics, and a faculty member from brain and cognitive sciences as our partners for this program. And our 3 postdocs started at MIT this semester. Faculty involvement with this postdoc program has been really important, not just for the postdocs, but also because it allows us to start to develop those close relationships and collaborations with faculty at MIT, and that's going to serve CREOS well in the long term. The postdoc program also gives us our most fruitful opportunity to actively integrate CREOS with the rest of the MIT libraries. I don't want CREOS to be sort of this separate entity off to the side of the library. I want it to be integrated, and I want the staff to feel that they have a stake in what we do. And so we were able to bring in stakeholders from the libraries. Once we had our faculty mentors identified, and we posted job descriptions for each postdoc scholar, we put word out to the library staff to see who was in. We shared the goals of the postdoc program. We've been sharing that all along, but we shared the job descriptions and talked about the faculty who were going to be co-mentors, to put the word out and see who was interested in working with either the postdoc program generally or with specific postdocs. And we got strong interest among several library staff, and they became stakeholders in the process, including participating in the candidate interview process as we selected the postdocs. And they're now involved as part of the mentoring and support team for each postdoc. So the postdocs get this benefit of expertise from library folks, and the library folks get to be involved in these research projects and in CREOS right from the get-go. Finally, within CREOS, and this is primarily Mike Altman's work, but with input from me and the other faculty mentors, we're developing a professional development curriculum. It's being developed with active sort of participation and input from the postdocs from the get-go. But the idea is to create a 2-year program that would provide professional development that would serve their career needs and aspirations, but also have a strong focus on giving them a foundation in what the existing sort of research issues, available data and methods and big questions are in this area of research on open and equitable scholarship. So again, our postdocs just got started this semester. Their research ideas are already taking shape. We've got one of the postdocs is looking at how to, this postdoc is working with our literature faculty, and he's very interested in that tension between open and equity. And so he's very interested in, he's also a digital humanist, so he's interested in finding ways to facilitate culturally responsive access to archival materials that might not be something short of fully open. And he's a digital humanist, so he's interested in, are there some technical tools that could help facilitate that kind of a response? And he's working with us and with this literature faculty, who also happens to be the director of the Digital Humanities Lab here at MIT. Another one of our postdocs is interested in understanding the relationship between lab cultures within, research labs, whether the culture in a research lab or a discipline is perceived to be a competitive culture or a cooperative culture, and whether that has any relationship to individuals' attitudes towards sharing their research openly. So that's one of the projects that I'm helping to co-mentor. It's very much a sort of social psychology, sociology kind of project. And then our final postdoc is looking at using computational methods to examine large bodies of data and assess the impact of openness in a variety of ways. Another final thing to note, one of the postdocs is actually also spending time this semester co-teaching a graduate seminar with her faculty mentor on tools for rigorous and reproducible science. And there's lots of library staff integration from our data management team and our subject specialist in that course. So again, CREOS and this postdoc program have allowed us to create stronger ties with a number of faculty and really integrate a lot of our work across what could have been silos, but we're trying to de-siloize, if that's even a word. So now we've gotten our postdoc program off to a solid start. We're looking at what's sort of around the corner, what's next for CREOS. We have another IMLS grant. This one is to develop a set of standardized, replicable, open indicators of equity and diversity in open. We're just kicking that work off now, but please stay tuned because we explicitly wrote into that grant that we would seek community input and community engagement during our work on this, because our goal with this grant and this work is to develop a set of sort of standard repeatable measures and indicators that the community could use to measure how open, how equitable, how diverse various parts of the system are. We have already a fantastic, amazing external advisory board. They're listed on the CREOS website. But we also want to go ahead and continue that integration with the MIT faculty and develop an internal MIT faculty advisory board. And then finally, as I said, the pilot visiting scholar program of one visiting scholar was such a resounding success that we are working on a proposal now to get us funding that would allow us to support a full-scale visiting scholar program. All right, so as promised, here's a bunch of the references. I can make the slide deck available. I think I already did, so that you can have it in, have your own copy of it. And then, as I finish up, I want to do a twist on the usual Q&A. I'm sure you all have some questions, but I want to do a twist on the usual Q&A and start with some questions for all of you so we can have a little bit more of a dialogue instead of me acting like I know all the answers. I'm interested from any of you all, sort of what ideas and needs do you have for research projects that might support any work you're doing to advance open scholarship equity on your campuses and amongst your faculty? How could CREOS support you in your work? And what advice do you have for us? And that leaves us with plenty of time for questions, I think. And you get, a bonus daily Jiffy.
Thank you, Chris. So now we do have time for questions. And if you can leave your slide up just for a moment so people can really marinate on the questions that you have here. I know I've been looking at them for some time now, and one thing that I thought of initially is you talked about one of the projects you currently have is about the economics of OA monograph. And I kind of think about the side of, where we as Oberlin schools participate, and that's in the library side of paying for making something open. And I'm one of my other questions for you today was going to be, how has COVID impacted this whole entire center? And one way that COVID has really impacted at least Bates is in the idea of we're never going to, not that's not the right word, but I don't see us getting more money over time. And how are we going to continue that support perpetually going forward when honestly, some of the easier things for us to cut are the things that we're paying for to be open. So I guess the thing I'm kind of offering you on the table here is the idea of, can you do a research project on library support and the sustainability of that for OA monographs, particularly, because that is just like a new buzz thing that's out there right now with all the different presses coming up with new models for doing that.
Oh, that's such a great suggestion. You know, and I think about, I don't know, it's been more than a decade ago, I want to say, there's some folks at OCLC did some research on spending on monographs, period, right? Not openness, but how, you know, they were sort of detailing how, you know, the basic effect that we all know where we're spending, our spending on monographs is plummeting to support journals, right? I wonder if there's something in that methodology that would be helpful. But yeah, I like that. And of course, I'm trying to figure out, we're trying to figure out whether there's a way to support kind of a green OA version of monograph publishing, where, you know, the manuscript is available openly. In an IR, the way, yeah.
Because there is, publishers are allowing us to at least put a chapter, at least in our IRs, but if it were a bit larger. So I'm just looking at the—
That's a great suggestion.
So I'm looking at the chat right now, and we have a couple of questions in there, one of which I believe addresses the questions that you posed for us. So I'm going to just take a moment to read it. The main thing I have on my mind these days is what systems can be put into place to advance open scholarship in a way that does not add and perhaps reduced friction for faculty. In other words, how can we achieve our goals without adding more work for them?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And that has been, it's interesting. I have two answers to that. Maybe more, I don't know, we'll see. One is, you know, I got to give credit to our colleagues at Johns Hopkins University who developed something called the PASS system. And I hope somebody Googles it real quick and puts something in the chat, but it's basically a system that allows people to do sort of one upload and multiple deposits. So it is designed to reduce the burden on faculty. So they can upload their, through the PASS system, you can upload your final manuscript. It'll go off to the journal. It'll also sort of scan you can click where your funding came from, and it'll take care of any required deposits. And you can click to deposit it to your institutional repository as well. So there is some development on literally systems to take the burden off of faculty. You know, at MIT, we take the burden off of faculty by, I was lucky to inherit a fairly large, comparatively large scholarly communications department. And so we do a lot of the going out and getting articles to stick in the repository. We do that work on our faculty's behalf. The other thing that I'll say, and this isn't really about research on equitable and open scholarship, this is more of a polemic for me, so I hope you'll let me get up on a soapbox for a minute. I actually have been thinking lately that we need to stop reducing the burden on faculty. They need some, you know, we've gotten as far as we can with open and equitable scholarship on the backs of libraries and librarians. It's time for faculty to get in the game. So
I like
that's
that.
Not a question. That's not an answer about how to do research, except that I do think there might be some answers in how do we incentivize, how do we move there? You know, what does the research tell us will incentivize faculty to do this work, right? They do work of all kinds besides just their research. What incentivizes them to do it? How do we do, how can we sort of, what levers can we pull successfully to get faculty in the game?
Chris, that is true, because I feel like we have faculty on this campus that are particularly doing activities with their students, showing that the metadata behind things that are online are actually created by people, and that it takes time to do that kind of work. So I feel like it's kind of going hand in hand in that. All this stuff is that libraries do is work as well. There's another point on the chat in regards to your question, so I'm going to bring that up first. At yesterday's President's Forum on Open Scholarship, there was quite a bit of discussion about graduals and concerns about misuse and misrepresentation of open scholarship. Are there plans to study if these concerns are well-founded?
Yeah, we don't have any specific plans right now to study this notion of, because there are always, there's always going to be that kid in the back of the room who says, well, what about predatory journals? Or, right? Or what about what about the dangers of the tensions between openness and national security, for example? These are legitimate questions. They're not an area of, they don't fall within that what I hope is a fairly tight research scope that we've set for ourselves in these initial years of CREOS, but I think they might come into play in terms of the impact of open and equitable scholarship, right? Trying to bust some of those myths is a way to demonstrate the impact of open and equitable scholarship. And of course, if we are successful in repeating our postdoc program or getting funding for visiting scholars, we want to try and sort of be as open as possible to a broader range of research topics. So if we get folks in who are interested in that topic, we'd be happy to support it.
And this is to bring it to your radar. You probably already know about this, but just a word of support for Lever Press, an open access monograph publisher that comes out as an initiative of the Oberlin Group Library. So if you weren't aware of that, maybe bring that up.
I was aware of it. Thank you.
Okay. So those were in respect to your questions, but we do have other questions from the Q&A. So I'm going to read the first one that I have in the list here. How does CREOS walk the walk? I have participated in some science of science research that I feel is important, is about important topics by way that research is done, perhaps especially at elite institutions like MIT, does not feel conducive to doing research in a way that lives its values. For instance, the way that co-authorship is defined usually prevents proper acknowledgement of how many people create research, and the need to get grants requires targeting work to the values and priorities that are already institutionally condoned by agencies and foundations, which tend to be relatively conservative, and the list goes on. Do you have thoughts about how CREOS and others can not only produce data and arguments and tools, but also model a truly different way of doing scholarship?
That is such a great question. It's something that that's a whole set of ideas and questions and provocations in a good way. I mean, provocations in a very good way, that we are wrestling with and haven't solved yet. Like, let's just, we are, I hope, doing our best to try and live our values in the way that we do research. But as the question points out, research requires resources. And right now, the folks who control the purse strings of the resources, play by a certain set of rules that tend to be fairly conservative. I've mentioned a couple of times, the majority of our funding has come from either IMLS or the Mellon Foundation. In some ways, that's purposeful, especially the Mellon Foundation money. The Mellon Foundation has a new president, over the last she came in 2 years ago, and her entire focus has been on equity and inclusion. And she's, and so we feel like we're, we're specifically targeting some of funding from folks who share our values. Right. But again, we work in the academy. The academy is inherently conservative. It's changing, but slowly. We also, I didn't talk too much about our external advisory committee, but we specifically chose what I think is a fairly diverse external advisory group, folks who do have expertise in research on equitable and open scholarship, but in some cases, folks who were at our Grand Challenges Summit and maybe didn't agree with all of the, we picked folks who maybe don't agree with us, because we want people to tell us if we're heading off course. And in fact, when we first pitched our version of a visiting scholar program, basically the external advisory committee says, well, you can probably get funding for that, but you'll end up with the same kind of scholars who always get to do these things. So they kind of sent us back to the drawing board. So one of the ways we try and live our values is to get people who will push back on us. And we try to share everything we do as openly as we can, and try not to be defensive about the feedback so that we can continue to course correct, because we're not going to get it right from the get-go, but we can get better every time.
That's a good mentality. Thanks, Chris. There is time for one more question if anybody has it out there. I don't see any more questions coming up, and we are approaching the hour. So because of that, what I would like to say is thank you all for coming. Our next lecture is on November 17th at 4 p.m. with Marion Posner, entitled Data Trouble. So registration for that is forthcoming. If you want to revisit a recording of this talk, it will be available on the website. Hillary's going to drop in the URL for that. Future lectures and registration will also be there. Thanks, Hillary, for helping me out today. And thank you, Chris, again, for joining us and providing information on CREOS.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for the great comments and questions. I really appreciate it.